It all started for Amos in the oddest way. He was returning home one afternoon. He had spent his day dressing sycamore trees. It was the kind of work that was normally done by itinerant farm workers like him. Sycamore fruit actually had very little value. It was rather troublesome to grow, and because the fruit didn't ripen unless someone came around and pierced the husk around every fruit with a sharp stick at just the right time. And that kind of work didn't pay very well. But Amos didn't have much choice. In between gigs as a herdsman, it was often the only work that he could find. His situation in life often meant that people underestimated Amos, but he had a quick and curious mind. And as he was walking home, he found that something did pique his interest that day. He came upon a man who was working on a house. The house was in very bad shape. This man had obviously been hired to do some long overdue repairs. But what Amos found interesting, was that the worker was holding up an odd contraption as he came up. It was a string with a weight attached to the end of it, and he was holding it up against one of the walls of the house, and he was shaking his head. Amos, ever a friendly guy, struck up a conversation with the worker and asked him what he was doing. And that was how Amos came to learn that the device the man was using was called a plumb line. And he used it to show Amos how the wall that he was working on was in such bad shape. See, he said, holding the line up against the wall. The wall should follow the line of this string, but it's going off at a bad angle. There's too much weight resting on the top of the wall and not enough weight in the rocks underneath to support from the bottom. And so the bottom of the wall is starting to crumble. This wall is not in good shape, and if the owner had waited a little bit longer to call me, I'm pretty sure it would have collapsed. And for some reason, that image, the image of that plumb line being held up against a crooked wall, remained with Amos as he continued on his way that day. He couldn't get it out of his head. It even featured in his dreams that night. Came to him, followed by a vision of a collapsing house. And when Amos awoke the next morning, he was convinced that there was a reason why he had seen that plumb line. And it wasn't just the construction worker who had shown it to him. No, he believed that Yahweh, his God, had shown him that plumb line. And that's basically how it started for Amos. He simply couldn't get the picture of that plumb line out of his head. And a few weeks later, Amos found himself on the road, leaving his hometown of Tekoa and on his way to Bethel, which was the chief sanctuary of the kingdom of Israel. After spending endless days meditating on the plumb line, Amos had concluded that it could only mean one thing. It was a message from Yahweh for the kingdom of Israel. Under the king of Israel, Jeroboam II, Israel at that time was living through a time of unprecedented strength and prosperity. The kingdom of Israel dominated the entire region, both economically and militarily. So much so that Amos himself constantly felt the influence of Israel upon his life, even as a migratory worker in neighboring Judah. How often had he crossed over the border looking for work there and been mistreated? And so the more that Amos reflected on the kingdom of Israel and what he'd learned about it in recent years, the more it reminded him of that wall that he had seen, the wall that was on the verge of collapsing. You see, the kingdom of Israel had built its prosperity upon the labor of farmers and workers, and even on the backs of lowly herdsmen and dressers of sycamore trees. And the people at the top of the kingdom had grown fat from the way things were set up. The whole structure of that society was out of whack, and Amos had come to see that collapse would inevitably follow. And so Amos had a message from Yahweh, and having received that message, he knew he had to share it with the people of Israel before it was too late. And so Amos found himself standing at the sanctuary in Bethel. He was standing just off to the side of the main avenue. And before him was a larger crowd than he had honestly ever encountered in his entire life. They passed him by as he stood there in his filthy, second-hand shepherd's robe. He had arrived at this sanctuary earlier this morning, shortly after crossing over into the territory of the kingdom of Israel from the south. And he'd never seen anything quite like this in all of his life. There was a large altar connected to a sanctuary that contained a calf that had been covered over with beaten gold. There were houses for priests and a treasury and a huge collection of booths and tents that had been set up by all manner of prophets and seers who were selling their oracles and divinations. And of course, there were also merchants who were hawking teraphim and idols and food and drink. It was all rather overwhelming to a hick like Amos from a town like Tekoa. But after a couple of hours in this place, he had begun to understand something of the social structure of the place and the interactions. He realized that the great mass of people had come up for the festival, and they were poor peasants. Some had brought with them a small lamb or a heifer to sacrifice and feast upon. But there were also a few others who had come. These were men and women who were finely dressed and attended by large retinues of slaves and clients. These were the elite from the capital city of Samaria who had come up for the festivities. And as he recognized them for what they were, he knew that they were the ones, above all, whom Yahweh had sent him to challenge and to defy. But Amos had yet to find his voice. He was having a hard time believing that anyone would care what he had to say about the whole situation here in Bethel, even if he did come to speak for Yahweh. But just then, there was a group of wealthy women from Samaria who passed by in front of him. They were well fed, and they wore fine robes and had painted faces. They were laughing and giggling, but what really bothered Amos about them was the fact that they seemed completely oblivious to everything that surrounded them, and all of the people who were anything but well-fed and prosperous. And that's when the rage that had been building in Amos ever since he had arrived broke through, and he began to shout. Yes, he addressed those women, spoke to them directly. "Listen to me, you fat cows of Bashan, who spend your days grazing on the slopes of Mount Samaria," he cried. He pointed at them directly. "It is you. You are the ones who oppress the poor and who crush the needy. And how do you do it? You do it by ordering your husbands around. Bring us something to drink. Bring us whatever we desire." And just like that, wow, Amos had an audience. Because, of course, most of the people who were coming up to this festival day after day were only too happy to listen to him. As the days went on, they began to speak him out specifically, looking to hear what he had to say. Yeah, because the word was spreading. People had heard there was a strange preacher from Judah who had come up to Bethel. And as the words of his oracle spread to the surrounding villages and towns and fields, people came to hear him. They loved to hear the way he piled abuse and scorn on the Samaritan elite. Oh yeah, he had them in the palm of his hand. And as for the members of the elite who were coming up to the festival, well, They weren't happy, of course, and they did what they could to quietly shut him down. They complained to the local priesthood and the authorities, but for the moment, the authorities at the sanctuary could only see the fact that Amos was bringing more people out to the festival, and that was money. And so they only made half-hearted efforts at telling Amos to tone down the rhetoric. "Hear me, you who trample the needy and bring ruin to the poor of the land," Amos shouted at the elite, while a growing band of admirers egged him on. "Here's what you are saying. When will this damn festival be over so we may sell grain at a huge profit? When will the Sabbath end so we can offer our surplus of wheat for sale?" That always got a big laugh. You know what they say? It's funny because it's true. But what Amos said next inspired even more anger than laughter. "I know what you say to yourself," he screamed. "You say since we control the whole system, we can trick people with false weights and measures. Oh, we'll push them all into debt over the purchase of something as small as a pair of sandals. And then when they can't pay, we will make them our slaves. Why, we'll even sell off the garbage we sweep from the floor of our barns at a huge profit. And there's nothing anybody can do about it." So did Amos preach all the days of the festival. And so as long as he was speaking in this way and mocking the rich and saying things that the poor folk didn't dare to say out loud, he seemed untouchable. The authorities of the sanctuary did not act against him for fear of driving the crowds away. But there was a core to his message that wasn't so popular, and that was more dangerous. And he went back to that original vision of the plumb line. Because you see, Amos was not only saying that the rich needed to stop oppressing the poor, as they had been doing, he was also announcing that the consequence would indeed be the collapse of society itself. "Thus says Yahweh," he announced. See, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of the people of Israel. Never again will I pass them by. The houses of the high places of Isaac will be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel will be laid waste. And I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. And that was dangerous. That was treason. And so the officials decided that they would not stand for it. Amaziah, the priest of the sanctuary, sent word to King Jeroboam, of all that Amos was saying, and he got back the authorization he needed. Yes, it was time to shut the prophet down. And so Amaziah went, flanked by lesser priests, to confront Amos. He came up to him, cut him off, right in the middle of one of his famous rants. "O seer," the priest said, "go, run away home to the land of Judah. Sell your oracles there, earn your bread there, and prophesy there. But never again prophesy in Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary. It is the temple of his kingdom." Amos looked around. There were seers and prophets all around him, were selling their oracles to the people. One had a booth nearby. He had a special that day, 2 oracles for the price of 1. Another had an offer out a half bushel of grain, and he would tell you whether your wife would have a boy or a girl, or perhaps give you the name of the man who would marry your daughter. Amos laughed. You think I'm one of them? One of these charlatans and fortune tellers? You think I'm here to exploit the people like their wealthy overlords? Ha! I am no prophet, nor am I a prophet's son. You know what I am? I'm a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore trees. There's only one reason why I'm here. Yahweh took me from following the herds, and Yahweh said to me, go and prophesy to my people Israel. So guess what? I'm not under your authority. Yahweh sent me here. Therefore, sorry to say, if you try and shut me down, I promise you this. Your wife will become a prostitute in the city, and your sons and your daughters will fall by the sword, and your land will be parceled out with a line, and you yourself shall die in an unclean land, and Israel will surely go away in exile from this land. Amos is a fascinating figure. He's basically a man who changed history because, of course, he was the first man who spoke a message from his God, Yahweh, in a particular way. Or at least, he's the first one whose words got written down in a book. But clearly, Amos didn't see himself as a prophet or a seer. He knew he was just an ordinary person. Before him, prophets and seers were people who hung around sanctuaries like the one at Bethel, selling trinkets and oracles and auspices to the common folks for a few coins or some goods. Amos did something different. He spoke a message of warning to the kingdom, a warning that was as much political and economic as it was spiritual and theological. And that made him dangerous. But the amazing thing, as far as I'm concerned, is this. What set him on that track? He saw a plumb line one day. Saw a plumb line. And that made him ask some questions about what was wrong with the kingdom of Israel. And when he figured out some answers to that question, he knew he had received a message from Yahweh, and that he had no choice but to go and speak, even at risk of his own life. Makes me wonder, how many times has God showed you a plumb line or something else that illustrates what's wrong with the economic and political realities of your kingdom? See, a prophet is not someone who hears voices, who speaks of far distant events, who knows without a doubt what God is saying right now. A prophet is just a herder or a dresser of sycamore trees. In other words, an ordinary person who's got a brain and can interpret what it means when he sees a plumb line or some other everyday object. Lord, oh Lord, send us some more prophets like that.